Great. Does this precariously perched mic work? Yeah? Okay, great. I just wanted to run through a few of the themes that we talked about last week, and I thought I'd start off with something that we arguably could have started off with another point, but I think it makes more sense now, which is to talk a little bit about definitions. Because it struck me that last week people were using the terms creative industries, cultural industries, in very overlapping and interesting ways, and that was part of the sort of value of it. But I just wanted to put up, if I can make it work. Nope. That's how you do it here, isn't it? So a tech person who can help me with the most minimal thing, which is to open a slide. Doesn't have to be a tech person. Anyone vaguely competent can... Oh, no, it's doing it. It's doing it. I think it's doing it, isn't it? No, that's the wrong one. Damn, sorry. Anyway, the point about this story is that I was typing in various definitions of creative industries last week when I was sitting here next to George. And it's this one, actually, I want. Sorry. That one, bottom one, yeah. Great. Can you read that? I can make it bigger, can't we? Can you... Just into that one, isn't it? What's the making it? Okay. Yeah. So I was sitting there laboriously typing in various definitions of creative industries and the way that they're used.
You can read it here, no one else can.
Okay. Well, you can get copies of it.
Go to Zoom. The little plus sign. Yeah.
Max, or just Okay. Yeah. Hey, you can almost read it now. Anyway, I'll talk you through them, so you don't really need to read it. But I was typing away with my slides, and then George was sitting next to me, and I said, "Which definitions do you use?" And so he started looking on the internet for definitions. And do as I do here. Do as I say here. Don't do as I do. So this little table, I cannot give you any reference for. All I can tell you is that George, you just got it off the internet, right? But it is quite a useful way of kind of summarising the way that people use this kind of terminology in a policy and, to some degree, in a kind of research context. So the first one, the UK, what's called the DCMS model, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, was the first attempt in 1998 to define and categorise something which was then called the creative industries. It was devised by a creative industries task force that was set up by the new Labour government in the UK in 1997. And to some degree, this has become a sort of model for what has sort of gone global in a sense, and become a sort of model for what people describe as the creative industries worldwide. Although, as you'll see, it's undergone lots of changes in its sort of travels around the world. The significant thing about this listing that you can see there, I think, probably, is the inclusion just before the end of something called software, which was the most contentious part of these kind of listings. It was basically included in order to boost the numbers of people who will be working in the creative industries. It was a fairly straightforward kind of policy move to say 8% of the UK economy works in the creative industries. This is hugely important. We need to pay attention to it. We need to give public money to it. We need to give policy attention to it. And the way to do that was to include software, which includes most of the people who work in these sectors are actually in that category of software. There's also a category 2 below that of video and computer games, which is actually sometimes called leisure software, which is actually the bit of the software industries which really can reasonably be described as a kind of creative industry. But the point about that is, in a sense, that this notion of listing kind of sectors, particular kind of activities, and saying these are the creative industries, was the way that this particular idea was born. And it's a relatively random selection of things. For example, you'll see that even in a European country like the UK, there is no kind of heritage and museum sector in here. So there is something called publishing, but there's nothing called writing. So if you're Random House, you're included, but if you're J.K. Rowling, you're not. So there are various. It's a rather kind of it's a totally untheorized and rather random selection of kind of activities. But it has been hugely influential in a way of saying there's certain parts of the economy we need to pay particular attention to them. They're growing fast. They're creating lots of jobs, and these are the things that we think are particularly important to us. The second model, what's called the symbolic text model here, is much more, in a sense, theorized, or at least kind of thought through, in that it's, you'll find this in lots of texts to do with the cultural industries. Dave Hesmontal's book, Cultural Industries, uses this model, and it's a way of arguing that the distinction between cultural activities and non-cultural activities is the degree of symbolic content. straightforwardly, in a sense. So Nike shoes have huge amounts of symbolic content, but you can still go for a run in them. Your Damien Hirst dot picture has lots of symbolic content, and you can't do anything much with it other than look at it. It doesn't have a utilitarian function, it has a symbolic cultural function. But the other thing about the symbolic text model is it primarily concentrates on the big media industries, the big kind of employers and the big sort of media industries, and describes quite interestingly what some people would think of as the core cultural industries, the creative arts, it describes as peripheral. And in an economic sense, that's absolutely the case, but as you'll see in a minute, there are lots of people who find that a kind of problematic notion. So they have what they call core cultural industries, which are primarily the media, the peripheral cultural industries, which are the creative arts, and what they call borderline cultural industries, which we've been talking about a lot this week, which are things like consumer electronics, the infrastructure that underlies this, fashion, which is included in the DCMS model, software, also included in the DCMS model, and interestingly, sport. And the debate about whether sport's included here is less of a pragmatic one and more to do with how heavily its symbolic content is affected by the fact that it's a rule-based thing. It's something where you actually play according to competitive rules as opposed to the arts, where there are rules, but the game is to break the rules. So there's a kind of interesting debate about whether rule-based things are purely kind of symbolic industries or not. I think sport is a cultural industry, personally, and always have, but here it's regarded as a kind of borderline case, in a sense. The third set of definitions, I think originally comes from David Throsby's book, Culture and Economics, but is now being favoured very much by the European Union. So this is the kind of European Union model that in some ways puts the arts, they call the core creative arts, at the centre of the kind of creative industries. And there are two arguments for that. One is that the act of creation is the thing which precedes all the other kind of economic activities. So that C.S. Lewis sits down and writes Prince Caspian. That's the core act of creation. That then gets made into a movie, which then gets made into merchandise. So it's a sort of, that's the idea, that creative activities are at the centre and other things flow from that. I personally think that's a highly problematic kind of notion because I don't think that that's how ideas circulate. I don't think they start with a particular activity and move outwards. I think they move in all sorts of different directions. But it's a way of, in a sense, trying to capture where a sort of value chain and a kind of ideas flow, in a sense. And also, some would argue it's a way of reinserting the arts back into this debate in a way that they were sort of being marginalised before by this kind of focus on kind of software and other kind of services. And the final one, which is quite radically different from the others, is the World Intellectual Property Organization copyright model. And this looks at what they call core copyright industries, interdependent copyright industries, and partial copyright industries. And this, I think, is quite interesting from the point of view of some of the discussions we were having last week about the role of IP and where IP value is created, and can you be a creative industry that's not IP dependent, in a sense. It's very clear that there are lots of people working in the creative industries who do not make a living from selling IP. Architects, for example, often designers, they sell their time effectively. It's a sort of consultancy model. They sell their time. They do not necessarily personally own IP. They get money from doing, it's a service industry model, effectively.
Could you explain what WIPO is? Does everybody know what WIPO is?
World Intellectual Property Organization. It's the primary pan-global body for the discussion and regulation of intellectual property. Anything else you want to say about it?
Well, it comes out of the World Trade Organization.
Yeah.
The way these things work is, just very quickly,
Yeah.
they don't have policing functions in the way that national legal systems do. What they enable is that for those people who are members of them, you can take before a court-like creation that they manage a dispute that you have. For example, if you say that, if a country says that a person in that country has a piece of intellectual property that is being misused by somebody else, appropriated unfairly, or that they don't have access in some way to exporting their own intellectual property in a legal manner, and the court finds in their favour, then what they're then allowed to do is impose some kind of blockage against the other country's intellectual property or trade. Okay? So a cultural industries example from the WTO was where the United States sued Greece over the importation of US-made television sets. Greece lost. That didn't mean Greece was then obliged, unless it agreed, to accept the importation of US TV sets. It meant that the US would stop something Greek coming here. Another example, and I'll stop, is about gambling. The United States has federal laws against online gambling. This is something that the WTO and the WIPO think should be allowed. So the United States lost the case about gambling, although there's a big debate about what losing the case meant. But needless to say, the United States said, we don't care what you people over there say, we'll do whatever we think. But those are the sorts of things that come up. So there's no policing mechanism. It's where you're allowed to do tit for tat, he said, she said, and if you win, then you can impose some kind of sanction on the other entity's capacity to export to you.
Okay. In terms of sort of category, classification categories, I think what's particularly significant about this is there's much more representation in the interdependent copyright industries of the kind of infrastructural industries that we were talking about last week, which generally don't get much of a showing in other debates about cultural and creative industries. And I suppose the question is, in a sense, who cares? What does it matter what you include and what you don't include, and why do we need these kind of categorizations anyway? And I think primarily that one of the issues is what you're trying, obviously, which of these makes most sense to you depends entirely on what it is that you're trying to do in any particular instance. But you do need, both in policy making and in research, very obviously, some defined object of study. In policy making, you need some object upon which to act. And therefore, if you're doing creative industries or cultural industries policy, you may be fully cognizant of the fact that there are lots and lots of things that have a bearing on the success or otherwise of the kind of policies you're implementing. You may be, if you're doing urban-based creative industry policy, for example, you realise that probably things like transport, of which you have no control whatsoever, are more important to the success of your initiatives than any categorisation you put here. But nonetheless, policy is organised in a way to have things it can put its arms around, things that it can define. Similarly, statistical gathering, it's a huge, huge sub-industry, getting stats on the creative industries in this sector, and you need to know what's in, what's out, what you're counting, what you're not counting. And primarily, there are sort of two, I suppose, or three approaches. There's the one that looks primarily at copyright and at IP issues. There's a sort of more European model, which for historical and to some degree ideological reasons puts the arts very close to the kind of centre of these things. And then there's a sort of DCMS model which has been adopted very widely in Australasia and in Asia particularly, although if you look at the Hong Kong work on this, they have a kind of variation on this model with the inclusion of some other things. But basically that sort of DCMS listing has been quite influential in parts of Asia. Okay, so definitions, and sort of definitions matter because it depends, as I say, what it is that you're trying to do, what you're trying to achieve. Sorry about this. But the point that Lisa was making, sorry about this, the point that Lisa was making last week about infrastructure, the issues that we were talking about the military, the issues that we were talking about sport, the issue of tourism in particular, which is in many of these initiatives very important. All absolutely valid debates, I think, and it's really it's been really useful for me particularly to talk about the creative industries in this kind of wider context. But I think it's important to know that there are effective definitions and delimitations of these kind of things that say what is it that we're talking about and why do we have this particular approach as opposed to another one. Right. The second kind of theme, I think, that came up, and that was extremely strong last week, started off with Andrew's paper and kind of continued in various ways throughout the week, was the issue of cultural labour and creative work. We started off with Andrew and George, to some degree, talking about the notion of a kind of global precariat and what it meant to be precarious labour, the way that was geographically organised, the class and regional inequalities that precariat had, and also talking about the notion of whether the precariat is a useful notion, particularly at a global level. Is it useful to have a term which tries to capture people making beads for Mardi Gras in Chinese factories and graphic designers in Berlin? Is it useful to have that notion? How kind of flexible is it? How geographically does it make sense? And then later on in the week, with Dick's presentation, particularly when he was talking about subcultures, and with Angela's presentation, we returned to a slightly different notion of the kind of precariat, and almost a sense which is, you know, we probably nowadays in a more critical mode don't think of as much. But I thought Dick's paper, and Angela in particular, was useful at reminding us that some of these notions of precariat come from a notion of kind of refusal of work, and of seeking more pleasurable work, and of seeking different kinds of identity through work. And somebody, Susan, who unfortunately can't be with us this week, who was here last week, asked me a great question in one of the breakout sessions, which she said she didn't want to ask in the group, but I would do on her behalf. She said to me, I've always been a sort of precarious worker, and I've always seen myself as outside of the conventional world of work. And at what point did I become an ally of neoliberalism? She said, when did that happen? At what point did that happen? When did that happen? And I thought that was a great question, actually. I thought that was a really valid way of expressing this notion that for a lot of people, the notion of work outside of conventional forms of work, of self-employment, of different models of work, is a potentially liberatory model. It's something that they see in distinction to other kinds of forms of work. So I think it's really useful, and I thought the way the week worked, in the way we discussed these kind of things, helped us to really keep both of those kind of notions alive in some way, and to remember that anything overly celebratory about the nature of cultural work has to take into account the absolute reality of most people's experience of working in the cultural industries. But nonetheless, there is, for many people who choose to engage in these things, and there's a huge amount of desire to engage in these things, there is this refusal of work, pleasure in work. There are these kind of issues about good work, which the cultural industries can also help us to see. Okay. Okay, third issue probably after definitions and cultural labour was geography. Huge amount of chat about sort of geography and place. We started off, one of the questions I was asked earlier in the week was about at what level creative industry policy making makes sense. What's the spatial level that it makes sense? And I, in my urban European mindset, immediately said, oh, I think it makes sense at a kind of urban level. It's about cities. And I can still defend that argument to some degree, but I feel much less confident about defending it now, a week later, than I did earlier on, particularly in the kind of discussions of Lisa's really interesting stuff about global infrastructure and the kind of very remote, rural communities where global infrastructure often takes place, is constructed, is deconstructed. So I thought that was kind of a really fascinating sort of discussion, a really fascinating kind of perspective on that. But we've also had discussions about place and community and identity issues, about gentrification that results from these kind of developments, and about what sense it makes sense to intervene, not just in a sense of trying to do things, but also in a sense of trying to resist things or trying to regulate things. So the fourth theme, again, which Angela touched on and Rick touched on, and people we were talking about quite a lot at the end, is at what level does policy making, at what level does regulation make sense? I mean, by the end of the week, I think we'd all sort of talked ourselves, having got rather depressed, possibly, or maybe I'm just speaking about myself, having got rather depressed earlier on in the week about the possibility of anything good coming out of this stuff. We'd all rather talked ourselves into a state of mind that what we needed was big government and big regulation. I mean, it may just be the Europeans amongst us. I certainly had a conversation on Thursday night with a couple of Europeans, and we were, in the immortal words of Joe Strummer, sort of talking about our safe European home and the possibility of big government and bureaucracy and what legislation could do for these things and how we could regulate these things and how, you know, this might be a way forward, and that was sort of somewhat Angela's argument. But obviously that doesn't make sense in huge numbers of contexts. The notion of kind of good bureaucracy, I think we need to unpick a lot more in this week and to talk about that. And also, we didn't really talk very much about potentially new institutions of the state and new pan-global institutions and new international institutions that might come about. We talked about it a little bit in terms of unions and organisation, but not really in terms of what would global governance mechanisms that we might like look like in these kind of areas. So I think that's something that we might touch on later on. Okay, and the final one, and this is really sort of queuing up Toby for talking later in the week on this one. We started off talking very much about the kind of role of the academy and what the academy, how this is changing the academy and how the academy affects these issues. And we talked about the academy as a producer of sort of effectively talent, and the issues about a labour force which is highly academised, as it were, or highly educated labour force, and how that's different from issues about other kind of labour forces. So the role the academy has in producing the people who work in the cultural industries. But we talk less, I think, about how is this changing the academy, how is this changing what the academy does, what is the... In fact, I didn't know until I arrived here on Monday that there was a crisis in the humanities. You'll be glad to know. But apparently there is one, and we still haven't sorted it out as far as I can tell. So that's obviously work to be done this week. Or maybe that's it. Maybe it's been so long in crisis that I just didn't notice there was a new crisis sort of thing. So that I think probably when we split into groups, particularly along those kind of lines, and later on in the week, and also I'm assuming possibly John's talk on Thursday may or may not touch on these issues of how these new ways of looking at the production of culture and the production of the humanities to some degree are changing what happens in the academy. Okay, is there anything anyone thinks is a burning issue? Primarily for Zhao's point of view here, that we didn't talk about, that I haven't mentioned. Anyone thinks, not a specific issue, but a big theme kind of thing. Is there anything else that you'd need to be clued in on if you just arrived from Mars or indeed from Vancouver and you want to be clued in for this meeting? What else did we not? Yeah.
So one thing that I would add to that excellent summary that you just provided is that we have touched here and there on both what one could call the geopolitical and geocultural specificity of flows and the inequalities between source originating flows. So that is to say, it's not a flat map, and it's not divided equally in regions that are absolutely autonomous, but the regions do have a certain degree of autonomy, and there is a hierarchy in the originating sources of the flows.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. And I think that came up very interestingly in the discussion that we had at the end about environmental issues. The issue of, as I put it somewhat crudely, but it helps me to think about it, the fact that Bangladesh and the Netherlands may be at the same sort of sea level, as it were, but come rising sea levels, the experience in the Netherlands and the experience in Bangladesh is going to be hugely different. Wherever you're from, wherever the flow is, wherever you're from, if you're physically in the geography of the Netherlands, it's going to be different from being physically in the geography of somewhere else. So I think the good thing about the environmental talk was it reminded us about real geography, not just the social construction of place, but actual places. And I think that was quite a good way of looking at that as well. But yeah, that's a good point. Anyone else? Good. I must have covered all the themes then. Excellent. Okay.